Hello, everyone. My name is Bharath, and I'm here to present my project, Assessing Cognitive Performance During Dynamic Activities with Varying Insole Textures. This project was conducted under the guidance of Dr. Aurel Coza. Our brains have their limits. Let's imagine a soccer player in the middle of a game. They're sprinting at full speed, skillfully dribbling the ball, all while keeping track of their teammates' positions and anticipating their opponent's next moves. That alone requires a lot of mental processing. Now, picture this. In that intense, high-pressure moment, they also have to make a split-second decision. Do they pass the ball to a teammate, take a shot at the goal, or continue dribbling? That adds a complex cognitive task to an already demanding physical activity. The brain now has to juggle both the physical and the mental, and that mental juggling act is cognitive load. Research shows that this cognitive load can significantly impact performance, affecting both the physical action, like executing a precise tackle, and the cognitive decision-making, like choosing the best passing option or taking that perfect shot. Dynamic activities demand focus, cognitive tasks compete for those precious mental resources, and our overall performance can suffer when our attention is divided. This is true not just in sports, but in many everyday activities, like adjusting our pace while running, strategizing during a game, or reacting quickly to environmental changes. The primary goal of our research was to investigate the influence of textured insoles on cognitive performance, specifically during dynamic activities like running. We wanted to go beyond measuring physical changes and explore how these insoles impact the brain's ability to process information and make decisions while the body is in motion. We aimed to determine how different insole textures affect response time and accuracy in a dual-task scenario. As you've seen, we used a combination of running and the auditory Stroop test to create this challenging mental and physical environment. We expected improved cognitive performance, particularly in latency, with the textured insoles compared to standard, smooth insoles. The hypothesis was that the enhanced sensory input from the textured insoles would somehow benefit cognitive processing. Looking ahead, the long-term implications of this research are exciting. We can demonstrate a cognitive benefit from textured insoles. In that case, we can then work towards developing optimized insole designs to enhance athletic performance, improve balance in older adults, and potentially even benefit individuals with cognitive or sensory impairments. It opens up a new avenue for exploring the connection between our feet and brains. Background: we experience the world through our senses. Every step we take, every object we touch, sends a stream of information from our sensory receptors to our brain. This is called somatosensation. Our sense of touch, pressure, temperature, and even our body's position in space. It's crucial for moving, maintaining balance, and interacting with the world. Think about your feet for a moment. They are constantly in contact with the ground, providing a continuous flow of sensory input. This connection is fundamental to walking and running to standing upright. What if we could amplify that sensory input? That's the idea behind textured insoles. By changing the texture under our feet, we can stimulate a broader range of these sensory receptors, sending a richer stream of information to the brain. Our research investigates how this increased sensory input from the feet might influence brain function, potentially impacting our cognitive performance. Our brains are mighty, but they aren't limitless. They have a finite amount of processing power available at any given time. Think of it like a computer with a certain amount of RAM. When we engage in physically demanding activities like running or playing sports, our brains dedicate a significant portion of that processing power to controlling our movements, maintaining balance, and reacting to our environment. This is already a considerable mental workload. Now, imagine adding another layer of complexity, a cognitive task. This could be anything from making strategic decisions in a game to simply remembering a sequence of instructions. This additional task creates competition for those limited brain resources, increasing cognitive load. It's like running multiple demanding programs simultaneously on your computer. Things start slowing down. This competition for resources can negatively impact performance in physical and cognitive tasks. You might find it harder to maintain your pace or react quickly, making your decision-making less sharp. Our research explores whether textured insoles optimize the brain's resource allocation by enhancing sensory feedback from the feet. Could they free up some mental capacity, allowing us to handle physical and cognitive demands more effectively? That's what we set out to discover. To investigate how the brain handles divided attention, we used a classic experimental method called the dual task paradigm, This simply means asking participants to perform two tasks at the same time. For the cognitive task, we chose the auditory Stroop test. This test challenges attention and processing speed by presenting participants with conflicting information. They hear the words left or right played through headphones, sometimes to the ear matching the word, sometimes to the opposite ear. They must respond by indicating which word they heard, ignoring the direction they came from. It's trickier than it sounds. For the physical task, participants ran on a track. Running provides a realistic dynamic activity, requiring continuous adjustments to movement and balance. Throughout these dual-task trials, we carefully measured two key things: response time, or latency, how quickly they answered, and accuracy, whether they answered correctly. These measurements allow us to see how well the brain manages divided attention under different conditions, giving us valuable insight into the interplay between physical and cognitive demands. Methodology. Our study involved 14 male participants between the ages of 19 and 28. For this study, the participants needed to maintain a routine of moderate physical activity to handle the demands of the dual tasking while running portion. We also thoroughly assessed their cognitive abilities as a baseline for our investigation. And, of course, all study procedures were ethically reviewed and approved by our institutional review board. It's important to note that the order in which participants experienced the insoles was randomized for both the VAST, that initial roughness test, and the DAST, the running and cognitive test. This randomization helps eliminate any potential biases or unreliable data that might arise if participants always tried the insoles in the same order. Fatigue or increased familiarity with the testing procedures could influence their perceptions, especially in the DAST, which involves the more demanding dynamic activity. Before we got our participants moving, we wanted to understand how they perceived the different textures we were using. We had them complete a visual analog scale test, or VAST. It's a straightforward way to measure perceived roughness. They tried 4 different insole conditions. Their everyday insoles served as the control, and we provided 3 other insoles, each progressively more textured. Imagine going from a perfectly smooth surface to slightly bumpy, moderately textured, and rough. For each insole, they simply rated how rough it felt on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is completely smooth, and 10 is very rough. This allowed us to quantify the sensory input, that tactile sensation, provided by each insole type. This provided a solid foundation for comparing the effects of the different textures later on, during the running portion of the experiment. To investigate the impact of textured insoles on cognitive performance during physical activity, we employed a dual-task paradigm combining physical exertion with an auditory Stroop test. Participants ran while listening to simple words, left or right, through headphones. They had to respond verbally with correct if the word matched the ear it was played in, and wrong if it didn't. This created a cognitive conflict, forcing the brain to carefully process the information and inhibit the automatic response of simply reacting to the direction of the sound. Congruent cues were played in the matching ear, while incongruent cues were played in the opposite ear. By measuring their response time and accuracy, we could assess how well participants handled the combined physical and mental demands, and how those measures changed with different insole conditions. The dynamic testing phase involved 4 trials with subjects running outside while wearing one of 4 different insole treatments. Each subject received a smartphone with the audio file and a headset and was instructed to maintain a comfortable pace. The audio cues, right and left, were delivered through stereo headphones, with half being congruent and half incongruent. Subjects responded verbally, saying correct for congruent cues and wrong for incongruent cues. These responses were recorded and used to assess the accuracy of their cognitive performance under different insole conditions during physical activity. To capture the data, we recorded our participants' responses during the running and auditory Stroop test. We used on-device screen recording with audio to get a clear picture of their performance. Then, using Adobe Premiere Rush, we were able to analyze those recordings. Conveniently, the recording included a flash each time an audio cue was played. This visual cue was incredibly helpful in synchronizing the audio with the participants' responses, allowing for precise measurement of their response time or latency. We then used Python to analyze the data further, calculating both response time and accuracy, that is, how many correct and incorrect responses they gave. This comprehensive analysis allowed us to see how both latency and accuracy varied across the different insole conditions, giving us a detailed understanding of how the different textures might affect cognitive performance. Results. We started by filtering our latency data, focusing on the 0.5 and 2.5 seconds range. This helped us remove outliers and get a clearer picture of the core data. Interestingly, we found that insoles 2 and 3 showed very similar roughness scores, as measured by the Visual Analog Scale, or VAS. Because of this similarity, we combined the data from insoles 2 and 3, treating them as a single experimental condition. Looking at the latency distributions, we observed that insole 1 exhibited more significant variability than the other insoles. This suggests a less consistent response pattern with insole 1. Furthermore, we noticed a trend. As the VAS score increased, indicating higher perceived roughness, the latency distributions became more condensed. This effect was particularly pronounced with insole 4, suggesting a focused and consistent response at higher VAS levels. Next, we examined the impact of audio-stereo congruence on response latency. Our findings revealed that incongruent audio-stereo stimuli resulted in a slightly increased latency compared to congruent stimuli. In other words, when the auditory information didn't match the visual or spatial information presented in stereo. This suggests that the brain requires additional processing time to resolve the conflicting sensory information when presented with incongruent stimuli. Let's focus on the relationship between response latency and perceived roughness. We found a compelling trend. Response latency decreased as the perceived roughness increased. In simpler terms, the rougher participants perceived the stimulus to be, as indicated by their Visual Analog Scale, or VAS, score, the faster they responded. What's particularly striking is that this relationship follows a strong inverse quadratic pattern, meaning the decrease in latency isn't linear but curves in a specific way. The polynomial mixed effect regression model beautifully captures this, boasting an R-squared value of 1. This perfect correlation indicates that our model perfectly explains the relationship between perceived roughness and response latency. Alright, let's wrap up with a summary of our key findings and conclusions. Firstly, we observed that insoles 2 and 3 elicited similar pain scores, suggesting that subjects had difficulty distinguishing between them. This highlights the importance of careful insole design to ensure perceptible differences in sensory feedback. Moving on to response latency, we found that decreased latency was associated with increased perceived roughness. This reduced latency may reflect heightened attention and improved cognitive performance. In other words, when participants were more engaged with the textured stimuli, they reacted faster. Importantly, these results are not isolated. These findings align with our previous studies utilizing the balance, proprioception and gait adaptability, where textured insoles initially outperformed the control condition. This consistency across different tests and studies strengthens the validity of our conclusions. So, what are the potential benefits? Textured insoles hold promise for enhancing cognition, balance, and overall performance across various populations. From athletes seeking improved reaction times to older adults aiming to enhance stability, the applications of this technology are broad and potentially impactful. Additional analysis. Our initial analysis showed a high degree of variability in individual response times. This made it difficult to draw clear conclusions about the impact of insole texture when simply averaging latencies across all participants. To address this, we performed two key additional analyses. Baseline adjusted response time, BART. Because baseline reaction times varied significantly between individuals, we calculated BART to normalize the data. This expressed latency as a percentage change from each individual's baseline control condition, allowing us to focus on the relative change in response time caused by the textured insoles, rather than being skewed by inherent differences in individual speed. This provided a more accurate comparison of the insoles' effects across participants. 2. Third-degree polynomial regression. To analyze the effect of textured insoles on individual participants, we compared the data from each textured insole to the control condition for each participant individually. We then averaged these individual differences to determine the overall effect. This analysis involved normalizing the data by calculating the baseline adjusted response time, BART, which represents the percentage change in latency relative to the control. This normalization was necessary due to the high variability in individual baseline response times, which ranged from 800 milliseconds to over 1 second. Analyzing each participant separately prevented misleading results that could have arisen from averaging across participants with such diverse baseline speeds. We visualized individual response patterns by generating bar charts for each participant, showing the percentage change in latency and accuracy compared to the control. These individual plots were then averaged to identify overall trends and explore potential relationships between insole texture, latency, and accuracy. The analysis revealed mixed results, with some participants exhibiting increased response times with textured insoles, while others showed decreases of up to 30% compared to the control. This variability may be partly attributed to the variability within the control data itself, which served as the baseline for comparison. Interestingly, a relationship emerged between perceived surface roughness, VAS score, and response time, with latencies generally decreasing as VAS scores increased. This suggests that insoles with greater perceived roughness may lead to faster response times. This analysis explored the relationship between perceived roughness, VAS score, and mean